A few years ago, we had an apparent suicide, pedestrian versus train. Hispanic male in his early 20s, and he left a note and then decided to go take a nap on the tracks. It was a mess. I mean a real horror show of a mess. And anyone who's ever had to work a railgrade collision knows that your investigation takes a back seat to getting the train moving again. So we are working like crazy to get everything in order so that we can release the train. Well, and this is the creepy part. The family claimed we missed something out there. Personal property of the deceased, I suppose. According to the mother and grandmother, this kid had a big, gaudy gold cross neck chain that he loved more than life itself. We searched for it high and low and never found it. We even came back out with a K9 unit and tried to pick it up, but still, no dice. At this point, it's just gone. Disappeared into thin air. Well, this guy's younger brother is a 17-year-old kid with a chip on his shoulder. He goes out there at night a few hours after we'd cleaned up and decided to look for himself. Before he went out though, he told his friends and family that the cops were worthless and that we were not trying to help. I shit you not. You cannot make this stuff up. He gets hit by a different train in almost the same damn spot on the tracks. You could still see the bloodstains on the shale. So sure as hell we go out, and I'm not even kidding. We find this poor kid over 100 feet of tracks, and he's got the gold chain clutched in his hand. That's some Final Destination shit right there. I felt so sorry for the parents. This happened when I was interning with the Sheriff's Police Department, so most of my time was spent on patrol. We got called out to do a wellness check, which the deputy thought was going to be a piece of cake, like she was out of town or something. We get there, and we are met by the neighbours, who told us that the mail is piling up in the mailbox, and that there are several untouched packages on the porch. So we go up to the house, and the front of the door is unsecured. So we crack open the door a couple of inches, and the deputy calls inside. But the door won't move anymore. The house was one of those split houses where the stairs met at the front door and the upstairs and downstairs are offset. So we concluded that there might be objects behind the door. It's about this time that the deputy tells me that she is a known hoarder, and that it could be why the door was stuck. He also mentions that if we see flies on the inside of the window, she is most likely inside and deceased. As we walk around the side of the house, we notice a lot of flies on the windows. The back door was locked, and we looked in and noticed bags upon bags of garbage, diapers and miscellaneous stuff all over the place. We head back to the front and attempt to make entry. He pushes the door open this time with a lot more force than before, and then from underneath, I see a grease liquid oozing out from underneath the door. The deputy stops, closes the door, and calmly tells me that the lady was indeed dead and wedged behind the door. From the dates of the packages, we concluded that she must have been gone for about 2 months. Once we did make entry into the house, I was allowed inside. After 2 months, she didn't even look like a human corpse. Her skin and body had sagged and melted to the floor. And her face was all black and had been for the most part eaten to the bone by maggots. I will never forget the smell when the coroners moved her and she popped. It was like a physical presence. Whatever those people get paid to deal with that shit is not enough. The thing that really got to me, though, was wondering if she had fallen down the stairs and died there, or if she fell and was unable to move and waited for help that would never come. A few years ago, I got a report of a missing husband. He told his wife and family of 6 children that he was going to get his tires changed, but he never returned. And this was 12 hours ago. They had purchased another house in the neighboring community, and the relationship with the wife was under pressure, so the wife assumed that he was staying at the other house and claimed that he would never kill himself. The strange thing about this report, though, was that he emptied his personal bank account into his wife's this morning as well. The wife explained this off, saying that they had recently got into a fight about finances, and that he agreed that he was bad at money, and maybe that they should just have a joint account that she controls. On a hunch, I asked his 14-year-old boy if there were any areas in the mountains nearby that his father enjoyed going to. The son identified a road about 10 miles away. It was nearing midnight, but I decided to drive to the top of this old, abandoned Forest Service road. As I drove through the snow and started to climb the road, I felt a gut feeling that I would 100% find this guy up there, either thinking about doing it or already acted out the suicide. The snow-laid gravel road had some sign of travel, but no real indication of how fresh the vehicle tracks could be. As I reached the top of the road about an hour after, I was honestly surprised that I did not find his black truck. I spent the drive back down thinking about gut feelings and how unreliable they were, but that I somehow felt different about this one. As I travelled up the road, I did notice over a dozen smaller roads branching off, but they were not mapped, and I had already spent too much time on a single occurrence in a busy city with way too few police officers. Nonetheless, though, I decided to check a single of these secondary roads, and about 3/4 of the way down, I picked a road at random to check, and sure enough, my headlights lit up the back end of a black truck about 100 yards past the first corner. Even if I hadn't memorized the license plate beforehand, I wouldn't have had to run it. It was clearly his. I radioed that I'd found the truck, parked my vehicle, and travelled the 20 feet to his truck, with my heart beating like I was doing a sprint rather than a normal run. What I found inside was a mess of brains and blood, caused by a self-inflicted gunshot wound under the chin. I'll save you from the description. There was just something about this gut feeling whilst travelling this abandoned and quiet mountain road, followed by a sense of being tricked by the gut feeling, then finding out it was true by discovering such a gruesome scene. Having to wait 3 hours next to his truck waiting for body removal and then to end it all by having to go to the family who is expecting good news to deliver to them the worst news possible. That makes me feel creeped out to this day. I worked as a park officer for a downtown metropolitan out of the Pacific Northwest. I saw my fair share of weird stuff on the night shift. Naked bike ride party after midnight with about 1,000 or so naked people chilling out, the occasional couple having sex, homeless people jerking off or shooting up heroin, and the occasional dead body. They were all a normal part of my job. Anyway, this one night we were sent to investigate a tent set up relatively near the waterfront, which was generally a homeless person that was trying to stay dry for the night. So we get there around 11:30 and tell the lady inside that she has to go a few hundred yards away to an area that is not patrolled. She fusses and complains about having to move, and then mentioned about a man living in a cave at the bottom of a shallow ravine, and that he had been killing small animals and eating them. We ask her for more information, and she points to a general area about 50 yards away through some thick brush. The general area that most people won't wander past. My partner and I started to walk through the thick brush with just our flashlights, and eventually stumbled upon the ravine. And sure enough, there is a small opening on the side. Enough for a person to fit in. I scale down about 20 feet and peek inside the opening and see what seems to be a massive pile of magazines, torn pages, articles of clothing, a sugar cookie tin, a gorilla costume hand, some crude looking tools including a makeshift bow, a few knives, and other generally weird shit. Being curious, and given that the cave was empty, I opened the sugar cookie tin and found a large amount of what seemed to be raw animal meat. At this point, I was thoroughly freaked out and decided to leave the area and inform the police of what I had found. We never found out what came of the guy who was staying there or what he was doing, but it was definitely freaky at around midnight in pitch black conditions. I've been a cop for a while now, and this is one of the calls that still haunts me. I get a call for a domestic assault that has just occurred, and I learn that the victim is at the neighbor's house. I get there and find the female victim's throat has been cut from ear to ear. The neighbor is holding a towel up to her slit throat, and the victim is struggling to breathe. The paramedics are on their way, and I take over holding the towel for the neighbor. I'm trying to apply enough pressure to reduce the bleeding, but not so much pressure that I am strangling her. I want a delicate balance. Quick law lesson. You know that there are laws against hearsay, right? Basically, I can't testify in court about the events that someone else has told me about and that I didn't witness. The person who witnessed it would have to testify to it. One of the exceptions is what's known as the dying declaration. If someone is on their deathbed and believes that they are about to die, their statements are exempt from the hearsay rules. I have some serious doubts that this woman is going to live. I want to ask her who slit her throat. In order for it to qualify as a dying declaration, I need to be able to testify that she believed she was about to die. So, I ask her 2 questions. The first, who cut your throat? Which she answered. The second was, you realize
that you may be about to die?" To which she answered, "Yes." Our eyes locked, and I still remember the emptiness in her eyes. Within a few minutes, the medics showed up, and my partner and I went next door to look for the suspect. The door was ajar, and we could hear a baby screaming upstairs. We went in with guns drawn, and a metallic smell of blood was overpowering. We made our way upstairs, past smeared bloody handprints on the walls, and found the child. He was unharmed, and the suspect was long gone. Thanks to the excellent performance of the medical staff, the victim survived. I met with her a couple of weeks later, and I was apprehensive to speak to her again. I had basically looked at her and told her that she was going to die. When she opened the door, I could tell that she didn't recognize me. She had very little memory of what happened after she was assaulted. I told her who I was, and she hugged me, crying, and thanked me for saving her life. The suspect ended up pleading guilty, so I never had to testify as to what the victim had told me that night. It still haunts me to this day. I am not a cop, but my coworker's father is, and he hit me with a whopper of a story once. For some background, I live in Austin, and all these occurrences were with the Austin Police Department and happened in 1978. An APD officer had pulled over a blue Mustang for not having a rear license plate. A man and a woman are inside. The officer tries to run the couple through dispatch, but the system is down, so he lets them go with a citation. After letting them go, however, dispatch lets him know that the man has an outstanding warrant. The officer pulls the couple over again and approaches the man. David Lee Powell knew that his arrest was imminent. Crawling into the back seat, he loaded his AK-47 and opened fire as the police officer approached. Mortally wounded, the officer called for backup before dying on the side of the road. Officer Villegas, my co-worker's father, hears on the radio that an officer is down only 8 blocks away and takes off straight for where he thinks the killer is heading, the highway. Before he arrives, however, he finds a blue Mustang in an apartment complex lot with its lights off, cruising at a really low speed. He peels into the parking lot, blocking the only exit, and calls for backup. Then a storm of bullets pound his police car, some from Powell's AK-47 and some from his lady accomplice's pistol. They exchanging fire, and Powell hurls a small oval-sized object towards the front of Officer Villegas' police cruiser. To the officer's horror, it was a hand grenade, and he was sure death was imminent. He explained that his last thoughts were being that of his wife and kids, and how he was sad that he would never be able to see them again. And that being the scariest moment in his 38 years on the force. But the grenade didn't go off, and Powell and his lady friend were out of ammo. As backup arrived, Powell took off behind the apartment complex into the woods, whereas the lady accomplice attempted to hide in a ditch. Seeing her in a ditch attempting to reload, Officer Villegas ran up to her and kicked her square in the face, shattering her jaw. Powell was later caught in the woods after a manhunt and received the death penalty for his actions that day. A friend of mine was a state trooper and had been for years. He had been part of a bust that involved 30 stolen IROC Camaros. He had changed tires for people and caught a guy doing 130 miles and then tried to pay his ticket with cash. Caught a .31 DUI. He has seen a lot. One night, he pulls over a guy who was swerving a bit. He didn't really suspect DUI, but he wanted to be sure. He pulls him over and calls in the plates and goes to talk to the guy to get his license. As soon as he turned around, the guy pulled a gun and got out. My friend turned back to find himself staring down into the barrel of this guy's handgun with no way out. He soon learned of this guy's warrants and how he wasn't going back. The guy got him down on his knees, and the guy kept talking for about a minute and then goes to execute him. He pulls the trigger with the gun held to my friend's head, and it jams. The gun doesn't go off. He quickly subdues the man and arrests him. The guy is lying on the ground crying. My friend gets back up, and this guy goes to prison. He was never able to return to patrols. He would freak whenever he had to pull someone over, and it ended his career. Years later, he went to prison to meet the guy, and forgave him for what he did that night. I guess it was to get closure. My dad is a cop. Obviously, he always tried to downplay the danger of situations to my sister and me, so he wouldn't scare us. But one morning he came home shaken. I was a teenager at the time, and I asked him to tell me what had happened. He and his partner were doing the graveyard shift, and there was a seemingly abandoned car on the side of the road. They got out to see if anyone was in it. My dad was first, whilst his partner stayed in the car to radio report. I'm not too sure how this next part happened, but as he was approaching the car, he realized that there were multiple people hiding in there. All of them were acting super strung out. As he's going to back away to wait for his partner, he hears his partner running over. He identifies himself as police to the people in the car and asks if there are any weapons in the car and things like that. His partner comes around and starts getting people out of the car, and they see a gun. Okay, kind of a biggie. His partner goes to start talking to the people in the car to see whose it was. In that time, one of their people had gotten away from the group. My dad was speaking with the driver nearest the front of the car, and his partner was talking to a few others towards the back. As my dad was questioning this guy, the guy's eyes go wide, and he kind of backed up. He turned around to see why, and a man had a handgun pointing to the back of his head. He's a cop, so obviously he's had guns pointed at him before, but never that close. Thankfully he is a beast, and he started talking to calm him down, and just telling him to take his finger off the trigger. Whilst he was doing that, he put his hand up slowly towards his face in the I surrender position, and the second guy took his finger off the trigger, and he stuck his finger behind it. Then he called over his partner and they handcuffed him. Obviously it's terrifying that if the driver hadn't widened his eyes, he would have never known and could have possibly been dead. But I'm thankful every day that he acted quickly. I rather like having him around. I arrived in at work at 6 AM and finished work at 10 PM. The previous night ended up running into an assault on an old man on his way home, and my commute was about an hour. So instead of getting home around 11, I got home around 11:45. I have a quick bite with my wife and go to bed around half midnight. 3 hours and 45 minutes later, I woke back up because I had to be in work for 6:15. I'm on station duties, and a man comes in and says that he thinks his wife is missing. He's very sketchy on details, and I'm just having to drag information out of him. Basically, they had a fight, she stormed out and didn't come home that night. I checked her on the system, and she's a respondent for a couple of domestic violence orders. I dig a little deeper, and I discover that they're actually against her son, rather than her husband. I am very, very tired and a little cranky. I look at the bare information I have, and send the chap home to wait for his wife. I check the hospitals on our own system to make sure she hasn't been arrested, and local fire and ambulance services. I circulate her details to all units in the city and record the incident. I have done enough to cover my arse, and technically, there isn't anything else for me to do for a while. I go and get a cup of coffee, and all I wanted to do was sleep. But something didn't sit right with me. I was suspicious of her husband. He seemed as if he were hiding something. I went down to my skipper and asked him if I could go to the house and have a look around and maybe talk to the husband again. The skipper isn't delighted about it, because it means he'll have to cover the desk because we're short-staffed. But he agrees like a trooper, and off I jolly well trot. I arrive at the house and speak with the husband again, and ask him if I can have a look around. There may be something that might shed some light on where she may have gone. I have a scout around the house, and find several containers of pills with weird names. After a quick Google search, I discover that this woman appears to be on a cocktail of antidepressants, mood stabilizers and other stuff. Oh, and I found an insulin kit. I ask her husband about these, and he mentions that his wife has some emotional problems. But I didn't think it were relevant, and put it to him that there is a lot of medication here, and ask if she has more than one insulin kit. He goes pale at that point. She'd left all her medication at home. I ask him where she keeps her purse, and we ended up checking her bedside locker. Her purse is missing, but I snag a framed picture for future reference, as I currently had no idea what this woman looked like. I ask him if I can search the room, and he's beginning to completely break down at this point and tells me I can do whatever I damn well please, and storms off into the living room. I am feeling distinctly queasy at this point, to say nothing of a banging headache from sleep deprivation. I don't find any suspicious holes in the wardrobe where she may have taken clothes, or any secret stashes of drugs or cash. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I search the bed. I turn over his pillow, and there's a note underneath it. It's a suicide note, explaining in no uncertain terms that she is intending to end her own life, and that she can't go on, and that she's sorry for being a burden. I radio the station and update them. I then have to walk down to the living room and tell this woman's husband that he had been sleeping on her suicide note overnight and never noticed. That was probably one of the hardest things I've ever been called upon to do, bar dealing with dead children. I found her eventually, though it took another 8 hours. We pinged her phone to a nearby town, but that just gave us general locality. I put the town to her husband, but he said that she didn't have any friends or family there. And after 15 minutes, he calls me back to tell me that they spent a weekend there shortly after they got married. I called the hotel they stayed in on that occasion, and they've got no one by that name. So I went down in person and showed them a picture of the lady. The person at the desk told me that a guest answering to that description had just left on a walk to the pier. I went out to the pier and found her, and we had a bit of a chat. Nothing dramatic. She told me that I looked awful, and I just said I was very tired. I asked her to give life a chance for a few more days, that her husband loved her, and that she wasn't a burden. She agreed, and we brought her home. A couple of days later, she came into the station with a box of chocolates and a card that read, "Thank you for not letting me kill myself." That's when I realized how close I had been to just letting the matter rest, because I had ticked all the boxes on the list. I went to the toilet at the back of the station and threw up for what felt like an hour. She sends me the same card every Christmas. We were called to an apartment, which was a reputed local drug den. A female we knew called and said that the male renter had been assaulted, and she had ran. We got there, and the door was bolted shut. I kicked the door over and over again, and it would not open. What I found out later is that the dope team had done a search warrant on the apartment a couple of weeks ago, and afterwards, the tenants had reinforced the door jamb with a metal plate. It took me a total of 22 times kicking the door before I broke the deadbolt in half, which flew across the room and hit the wall. We made entry, guns drawn, and started clearing the apartment. This place was the kind of spooky I'd seen in places where a lot of meth is done. It was dark. There were swastikas, 666, upside down pentagrams, etc., painted all over the wall. Pictures of faces hung off the wall, with the eyes X'd out, and baby dolls with their eyes scratched out into X's. As we cleared the first room, we started seeing the blood, first on the bed, and then a trail on the floor leading back to the room. The layout was weird. One main room, and then a back room, which was more of a hallway and a bathroom at the end of the hall. We followed the trail of blood down the hall to the bathroom door. In front of the door was the renter's dog, which was shaking uncontrollably and pissing all over the floor, scared out of its mind. As we got closer to the dog, it became very aggressive because it was scared. I made my way around the dog and entered the bathroom, where I found the renter hunched over in the shower, bleeding from his face, holding his cheeks with his hands. He was frantically trying to talk, pleading with us not to hurt his dog. Blood was dripping from his mouth, and I couldn't understand him. Then, I saw the extent of what had happened. His jaw had been dislocated on both sides when he was beaten by two men with a hammer. It was just hanging there. As he was trying to plead with us, he could only attempt to talk by flicking his blood-covered tongue in the pattern of words, because his jaw didn't work at all. This was told to me by my EMT friend. In one of the apartments in a nearby city, the apartment manager went in to investigate a really bad smell in one of the lower units. Apparently people all around it were complaining. Once he saw what was up, he called the ambulance. So first responders show up, which included my said EMT friend. And there's this lady sitting on a couch. There's also something squirmy going on down in her underpants area. So they check her out, and in the process remove said undergarments. And out falls a swarm of maggots. Apparently said individual had a fairly strong substance abuse problem. Some of the needles she poked into her nethers, which caused an infection. This led to rotting flesh, which attracted flies, which in turn led to maggots. The worst part, she was not dead, just so drugged up that she basically never noticed that she was literally rotting and falling apart from the waist down. My grandfather's cousin had been a coroner for years, and they had to get into a house of a guy who lived alone. It was just him and his dog. The dog had been chained outside at the time that this guy died, and obviously there wasn't anyone around to unchain him afterwards. It had been days in the southern sun, so someone at some point unchains the poor dog before the coroner gets there. They have to hold onto his collar because he is frantic and desperate to get inside of the house. The coroner gets there, they bust the door open, and the dog manages to slip away from the person holding the collar. The dog dashed past everyone and leapt on the body of the dead owner, no doubt to protect him, at which point, apparently, he exploded. You may be wondering why. The bacteria in your gut that makes you fart starts eating your body after you die. They're still making a lot of gas, but now it doesn't have an easy way out. So the body fills with gas, and at the same time the skin is getting thinner and weaker. So the end result is basically a very grisly and foul-smelling flesh balloon, 5 to 6 feet long, and then along comes a dog with sharp scratchy claws, and boom, it was entrail confetti for everyone. I spent my first year as a constable in an inner city suburb of Queensland. Now, of the population of the area, something like 40% was reserved for government commissioned housing for rehabilitated criminals and persons released from mental health assessment centres. So there was a share of creepy shit, but to be fair, for the most part, the people who we dealt with were more like cartoon characters than super shady creepy, but they had their moments. One guy that we had just met before decided one afternoon to start destroying shit in the commission setup of units he lived at. He was going crazy, kicking through latticing, throwing pot plants off buildings at passers-by, stealing and collecting people's shoes, smashing car windows and the like. After about 15 minutes of mayhem, he must have ran out of steam and gone back up to his unit. That's where we found him, and he decided to bung on a turn. He would just not stop screaming and bashing his head and face into any surface or object that he could find. Eventually we got a van with a pod and secured him. Then we went back into the house to try and figure out what had happened. The house were like a cluster bomb had gone off. Somehow he had fit 2 Coils trolleys inside and was using them as furniture. The whole place stank of rotting food and shit, and on the coffee table, if you can call it that, there were a series of scrawled notes of just expletives. Again, not massive mental function with this guy, as well as a wooden box. Inside the wooden box were about 100 small clip seal bags. Over half of the bags had a brown granular organic material in them, and the others had clear crystal-like stuff in them. The brown bags were somewhat organised from the smallest to the largest staples. Now, with the type of people we had in the area, we had all sorts of wonderful ways these people got high. We were used to seeing weird shit that people would ingest, so we didn't recognise these bags, but were quite confident that they were a narcotic of some kind. So, of course, we examined the bags and their contents, and there's enough to test if need be. So I go to get one of the bags and empty its contents to see it better. So these samples of brown material, they've got flecks of colour and little tendril-like hairs, not unusual for plant derivatives to have, but I've never seen it before. So I'm looking at it, I'm holding it, talking to my partner that it may be a really coarse hash derivative, or byproduct of production or something else, and how this might potentially explain why the guy went nuts. The dog unit officer who assisted with the arrest comes in. He sees the scene, looks at the coffee table, and looks at the bags, looks at me holding at the contents of one in my palm, and straight away goes, "That guy's got golden staph. He's been collecting scabs." This guy had been picking at a golden staph infection on his leg, collecting the scabs, organizing them into smallest to largest, and then eating them. The small yellow crystals, snot and crust from his nose, with the same end goal. I got dispatched to a call. The daughter had tried to reach her elderly mother and couldn't make contact. For the most part, these usually end badly. We got to the location of the house, and we had received written authorization from the daughter to make forced entry at the front door. We asked the daughter to wait by the squad car and had the fire department spreading the door frame open. Immediately, I noticed the smell and began to search the house. I found her mother in the kitchen, laying on the open door of the oven. Half her face and hair were burnt off, and the oven was still on, cooking her. Apparently, we found out from the daughter that the mother used the oven for heat and had a heart attack and fell on the oven door. Best thing I can say is that it looked like Harvey Dent from the Nolan Batman film. I got a call from a woman screaming from an abandoned apartment, saying that she was being tortured and killed. My partner and 4 other officers and I had to search every room and door in what looked like a college dorm. All the doors faced inward, and there was absolutely no way of knowing where the screams were coming from. My partner found the woman covered in her own blood, running out of an apartment. I held the apartment door whilst he ran her down. Scariest call of my life. Turns out she was tripping on PCP and had been cutting herself. There was no way of knowing that until we searched the apartment, and I swear that Michael Myers, Krueger, or Chucky were waiting behind every door in that apartment, just waiting to stab me. It was an awesome time. My uncle is a cop and likes to tell the story of the time he showed up to arrest a 15-year-old who skipped school to throw rocks through some cars and steal things inside them. He gets there and knows the kid. They've gotten him a few times before, one time for turning up to school with drugs, and the other time for carrying a knife at school. They knock on the door, and his 18-year-old brother and 17-year-old sister open it. The cops kindly tell them what they want, and the duo then respectfully tells them to piss off. The cops show them that they have the warrant for this kid's arrest, and that they need to open the door. They get told, this time more rudely, to leave. So, getting quite annoyed now, another cop car pulls up and asks what's going on. As they're being uncooperative, they know that they may have to force their way in and break the chain. The 18-year-old shithead says that he has a gun, and about 3 seconds later the door is broken down. The 18-year-old is quickly tasered, and the 17-year-old girl is screaming for her brother to book it. So he jumps out the window and manages to get away for now. The brother is thrown in the cop car, and the 17-year-old very cleverly slaps one of the officers in the face and ends up getting the same free ride and a new pair of bracelets. They then call the property manager to get permission to enter the house and complete the investigation. The second floor reeks. It's the worst smell they've ever smelt. They get upstairs and it just gets worse and worse. They open the door and find a long, rotten body, surrounded by needles and other drug shit. They leave and call it in. Uncle says that later it came out that their grandmother died of an overdose. The mother was in jail for stabbing up some guys, and the kids never reported the grandmother being dead, so that they could keep cashing in her social security checks. She had been sitting there dead in a corner of a room for about a year. I was a fresh officer with dreams of being a hero. I get dispatched to a call of a family fight. Not wife or husband, but brother-sister. The female was reporting the male had attacked her. I arrived and located the female and the male. The male I knew from prior contacts. I detained him in handcuffs and quickly smelled a strong odor of pepper spray. I found out that after the male knocked off the female's weave, she pepper sprayed him. I knew there were different types of pepper spray, like gel, and I'm walking around the house taking photos for my investigation and assessing the property damage. I noticed that in his room, the odor of the pepper spray was extremely strong and made my eyes sting and water instantly, with a decent amount of stinging sensation. The fumes had made it incredibly hard to breathe and left me without the ability to breathe at points, requiring me to leave the room to get fresh air. I then find a brownish gel substance all over the walls in the shape of handprints. I photographed the evidence and determined that it was the pepper gel that the male suspect was wiping off his face onto the wall. I found it odd that it was all over the walls and covered the room. I thought this chick dusted him with the entire can of pepper gel, and after some investigation, I took the male to jail. I responded to the same house several days later for an unrelated medical issue. There were more family members at the house, and the male was still in custody. I was having a conversation with the family as the hero firefighters were saving the day. I inquired if they had fully cleaned up the pepper spray from the male's room, and they gave me a strange look and told me that there was none in there. I told them about the gel that was on the wall, and then I sat there in horror as they explained to me that this man had been, for years, ejaculating on his walls and playing with it, and the gel was in fact the fumes that were released after years of accumulation. My God, was it foul. A former officer of the law told this to me years ago. The officer had responded to a parent's call to arrest their son, who they were convinced had relapsed on meth. What had tipped them off was that the son had started blasting both thrash metal and porn on max volume from his bedroom and locked himself inside. Communication with the kid was impossible with the noise. However, the officer's partner had been able to glance into the kid's window and can see that he was sitting motionless in front of his computer. He was shirtless, but otherwise everything seemed rather normal. With permission from the parents, the officer decided to push through the lock. Moans and groans and relentless guitars deafened the ears. The only light illuminating the room was the bluish hue of the computer monitor. The kid's face was a disoriented grin, stretching to his lips' furthest limits. He wasn't shirtless, he was in fact naked and drenched in sweat. In his right hand, cupped like a chalice, were his testicles, which he had ripped off in a flurry of drug-induced self-mutilation. I was taking this law class, and my professor brings in a cop to talk about points of law. At one point, the cop shows the class a picture of a man who committed suicide by gun. "Can you see what colour his eyes are?" he asked. Of course no one can, and after some dumb stares, the cop says, "Blue. One blue this way, the other blue that way." The whole class groans and raises her. The whole class then groans, so I raise my hand and say, "Obviously you have thicker skin about this story than anything we do, but have you ever seen anything that got to you?" The cop then got very serious and told us this story. A local family, 2 brothers, both very young, every Saturday morning, the older brother would get up early and make toast, and both he and his younger brother would sit in front of the TV, munch some toast, and watch Saturday morning cartoons. This one Saturday, the older brother didn't want to get up and make toast, so the younger brother decided to try it for himself. He apparently went to the kitchen and put the bread in the toaster and then pulled the switch down. He didn't notice how close the toaster was to the kitchen window curtains, and to make a long story short, the house caught fire and the parents barely made it out alive with their eldest son. By the time the police officer arrived, the younger boy was dead, burnt to death in the living room. The officer said he must have set the toaster and went into the living room to watch TV and wait for his older brother to wake up and join him. The officer said that the window nearby had collapsed from the heat and melted around the little boy. The cop said he had 2 boys about their age at the time, said he needed to excuse himself from the scene, and went into his squad car and couldn't stop crying and shaking. As the cop told the story in class, he started crying again. I responded to a 911 hang-up at our ranges around 9 p.m. They are out in the middle of nowhere, in the woods near an old wildlife refuge, so they are pretty isolated. There are no streetlights out there, and it's a few buildings with lots of open fields for sniper ranges and tons of woods. I pulled up to the gate, unlocked it, and drove in. I parked and walked up to the classroom, where the 911 hang-up phone was located. I should also note that this entire area has significance to the Civil War era and World War II, as it was a military installation. I would also like to note that the number for the 911 hang-up does not exist, but it occasionally trips our dispatch call center for unknown reasons. I've had my fair share of paranormal experiences, mostly when I was stationed in Japan, so I take the patrol shotgun out just to feel better about the entire stupid call in the darkness of the night, whilst responding to a 911 hang-up to a line that no longer exists. I unlock the door to the small wooden building. It's a trailer. As I open the door, the only light illuminating my path is a red exit sign directly above the door. I don't see any light switches, so I take a few steps in to locate them. As I do, there is a doorway directly to my right. By this time I can see in my peripheral vision a human-shaped shadow with the red exit sign illuminating it. I turn quickly with the shotgun as my heart starts racing. I can make out the face. I quickly start hitting the wall and manage to find a light switch, which reveals a training dummy sitting in a chair. I take a breath and step back outside onto the deck and radio in for assistance, as I am no longer prepared to go on this ghost hunt alone. I go back inside and do a quick sweep of the building. It only has 5 small training rooms, and I also check the room where the phone line does not exist. There's no phone. Shocker. I then walk back outside and wait for my backup officer, who comes within 8 minutes of my call. Once he gets there, he already knows how dumb this is, because this call is creepy whenever we get it. We then proceed to check around the outside of the remaining 3 buildings in the area, and there's nothing. So we start heading back to our vehicles. As we approach our cars, an alarm starts going off on a small metal box attached to a metal unit sticking out of the ground. It flashes a red light affixed to the top of the box. We look at each other in dismay. Really? And start walking towards it. It's located between the training range and the Range Bay office. I radio in the alarm and ask if they can contact facilities, since neither of us knew this thing was even out here, and we had no idea how to shut it off. I then notice that there is a small keyhole on the metal box that is attached under the light. I grab my key ring and try to find a key that I think would fit. As soon as I made contact with the key to the metal, the alarm and flashing lights stopped. I looked at my friend and said, "We need to leave." He agreed, saying that this is getting stupid. I radioed in and told them that the alarm had stopped and we were back in service. This was the one and only time I had responded to a call of that nature, but others also had to do it. There are a few grave sites out there with markers from the 1800s, but nowhere near the range area I was at. It's a pretty historical area, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are a few spirits still roaming around the area. I'm an officer in New York City. I've seen some insane stuff. A lot of the things that have happened to me have been very nasty and gory. However, this was the creepiest thing by far that I have ever seen. I was sent to a wellness check. The individual in question was found lying face down on the bedroom floor, dead, and had been for a few days at least. The deceased's room was littered with voodoo or witchcraft shit. Whoever it was into some weird crap. After the body was removed and the family notified, the apartment was sealed. Now, for New York City, this means that the door is locked, and a big fluorescent green sticker is placed over the door and the door frame, so that the door can't be opened without the sticker being torn. Fast forward a week or so, the deceased's brother arrives with the surrogate court paperwork to enter the apartment to try and find a will. We get to the door and the sticker is ripped. Thinking someone like the superintendent of the building had went into the apartment without permission, we had the security desk pull up the camera footage of the hallway. After about 20 minutes of looking for it, we found it. The door seal, for no apparent reason, quite literally exploded at the seam. Footage just showed an empty hall with the door in clear view. Then suddenly the seal just pops at the seam, sending pieces flying to the door. The door had no give or gap to jiggle it, so a quick pressure change couldn't move the door significantly to cause it to rip. That shit was creepy as hell, and we still have no explanation for it. I just wanted to say good luck to whoever had to pick up all those voodoo dolls. Firstly, let me start by saying that there is a Whataburger of death in our city. Every time I've gone there, I have immediately had to respond to death after death, at least 3 times. It's around 3 AM, I believe, and so I was dispatched to an open door alarm across town. I arrive, I park a bit away, and I walk to the house. As I am approaching the front, my partner pulls up, and I say, "It looks clear, but I haven't gone to the door," and he remarks, "Well, it's open, so..." Now, I promise you, I'm not an idiot. I had just pulled up at an angle that I couldn't see the front door, and I was going to check it last. So we approach and announce. He and I remember that the resident of this household is crazy as hell. She calls him regularly to complain about things, but is absolutely paranoid. She says things like she is deathly allergic to any fake scents, and so won't talk to you if you're wearing perfume or deodorant. Her son is also a severely mentally handicapped adult. Her husband is relatively normal, but she kicks him out the house all the same. He's quite used to it, to be honest, so he goes and stays in a hotel for a week or 2, and then comes back. There are lights in the kitchen, as well as lights on in the back room, so we open the storm door and announce more. However, we get no response. We start to clear the house. Immediately to our right is a dark hallway with doors on either side, as well as at the very end. We decide to take that first. As we shine our lights down, we see all of the doors are open, and at the end of the hall is a bedroom with someone lying in the bed. More announcements. We continue to approach and get no response. Now we pause and think, what? And then we realize the person is a woman, and their eyes are open and they are staring straight at us. We get no response. Dude, is she dead? No, dude, she's breathing. Look again. Yep. There was a steady rise and fall on her chest. Okay, she's crazy as hell. Maybe she's being crazy. Maybe she sleeps with her eyes open. Our little discussion continues as we walk down the hall, clutching our guns. Still no response. We clear the rooms to the left and right very quickly, neither of us wanting to take our eyes off her. We get within about 9 feet, and again we repeat, "Ma'am, it's the police." There's nothing but a blank stare and breathing. Dude, there's a gun by her pillow. Now we're dumbfounded and freak out a bit. I think that no matter what, I don't want her waking up and coming to grab it. I lunge for the gun immediately, and then it hits me. The gun was in a pool of blood. I yell, "Yuck," and throw the gun onto the ground. My buddy asks what's wrong, and I tell him that it's covered in blood. So, he steps forward and hits the light switch. Then the full scene is clear to us. She's lying on the bed, with a gunshot wound to the head. Blood pooled in a crook of her arm. No blood was on the floor, and the sheets were very dark colored. I couldn't see any of it until the lights were on. She's still breathing. We should ask for a medic. Code 3. I tell my buddy to go get the camera. He comes back in, and at one point, one of us exclaims, "Crap, there's someone else in the bed." A small tuft of hair was visible from underneath the covers. We'd thrown it back to see the adult son, half of his head out, with glazed over eyes. We updated dispatch. 2 gunshot wounds to the head, 1 dead. We kind of step back. The medics are already on the scene. The medics take one look, pick up the lady, and toss her on the floor, grab the male and put him in the gurney and run. Turns out that most of his brain was on the bed. His nervous system was intact and was keeping him breathing. She was lying on top of him. His breathing made it look like she was breathing. She was dead as a doornail. It was a murder-suicide. We never found out what happened to the guy. But honestly, I don't think it would have been all that great. And for those few minutes that we thought she was still alive, were some of the creepiest of my life. This happened a few months back. I work for the emergency services. This happened a few months back. We get the first call around 10 AM. I asked the medic what the call was, and he says it was a 44. I asked him what that was since I hadn't heard of it before, and he says that the guy had shot himself with a 44. I wasn't sure if I should believe him since he bullshits sometimes. We get to the scene and the police are already there. The 2 officers and some volunteers are waiting by the door. I walk into the house and instantly something didn't smell right. I look around and notice the guy is a hoarder. I think maybe it's something thrown around that smells. We continue to the bedroom, and there's a guy lying face down, head between his nightstand and his bed. It smells pretty bad. He had a gash on his head from where he hit his head and fell, and I'm guessing hit the nightstand. He was 60 years old and pretty unhealthy. The other medics and police said he probably didn't die right away. The guy had been dead for about a week, and he was starting to decompose. He had maggots on him, and his skin was wet to the touch, with bubbles of water deposits on the outer layers of skin. They made us check for a pulse, so we hooked him up to our monitor, and surprise surprise, he had no pulse. Like, really, how dead can he be? The smell was similar to a dead animal smell, but it lingered, and I would occasionally smell it throughout the day. On my way home, I passed a dead animal, and since I was on my Jeep with no top, I got the smell pretty hard, and I almost puked. We got sent to do a well-being check for an old lady that lived by herself in a rough section of the city. This was a few years back, but if I remember correctly, she had no family or friends, and some sort of wellness aide had called it in. No one had heard from her for a few days. We knock and announce ourselves, and we get nothing. We get a property manager on the phone, and he comes by with keys. We open the door, and there she is, very dead on the floor, with a look of fear and pain frozen over her face. One of her feet was detached, and was about a meter away from her body, with blood everywhere. I instantly assume she was murdered, and get a shot of adrenaline. But when we take a second to take the whole scene in, we figure out how the woman died. She needed to adjust her blinds, so she got a chair from the kitchen, stood up on the chair, and lost her balance. She fell and landed on her foot, which snapped clean off her leg. She then proceeded to crawl around bleeding until she passed out and died. I've seen much worse, but this one sticks with me, because I can't even imagine the thoughts running through her head as she was dying, all alone and unable to summon help. I was an MP in the army many years ago, and I believe it was 2005 when this happened. Shortly after our shift started, we were called to secure a crime scene in one of the on-post housing areas for lower enlisted folks. When we arrived on the scene, we were given a very vague overview of what occurred by the first responders and CID investigators present. A 19-year-old infantryman, fresh off deploy, brutally stabbed his young wife to death. I think she was 18 years old. Too damn young either way. We were obviously given very little information because the investigation had just started. But while securing the scene from the exterior, we were able to see the aftermath of everything that had happened through the windows and open doors. And what we were able to see was straight out of a horror film. The back door of the house was left open, and one of the first things you noticed on approach was a bunch of tiny, bloody paw prints on the back porch. Looking further into the house, you could see dark stains on the carpet that looked like a body had been dragged across the floor, again, with tiny bloody paw prints scattering the scene. Turns out, they had a tiny dog that ended up roaming through the aftermath, scattering the tracks around. Going to the front of the house and looking through the kitchen window is where we see the real bad stuff. The body had already been removed by the time we were able to get this view, but you could tell where she had finally died. There was a giant pool of blood on the floor, with what I can only call a halo of kitchen knives in a circle around where her head was. Blood was absolutely everywhere. On the fridge was a note scrawled in blood that read, "Satan said she deserved it." I absolutely shit you not. Several days of securing that scene later, they finally closed it down and boarded up the home. The body was being held at the post-morgue, and we ended up needing to put a guard in the morgue to secure the body until the formal autopsy could be completed. I was the lucky son of a bitch that pulled body duty when the autopsy occurred. I was asked to sit in on the procedure, and it was easily the most horrifically graphic thing I have ever, and hopefully will ever, witness. The poor girl was destroyed. Her husband stabbed her something like 50 to 60 times. The first thing you notice was the meat cleaver stuck in her neck. They just left it there. Just above the cleaver, her lower jaw was basically gone. I couldn't tell you how it was removed, but her tongue was just resting on her neck. The second thing you noticed was the absolutely perfect pentagram that was carved into her chest. I'll never forget how perfect that circle was, and how the angles of the star looked like they were all made with a protractor. This sicko took his time to do this to her. The third thing I noticed was her hand. It looked like as if she had her hand put up in front of her face to block a strike and caught the cleaver across the palm. 3 of her 4 fingers were dangling from a flap of skin barely still hanging on. This all seemed too much. But it got worse. As the medical personnel continued to catalogue the damage, they noticed what I think was the absolute worst of it all. They ended up pulling out a 14-inch long knife sharpener out of her vagina, the hilt of which wasn't even visible from the exterior of her body. He had inserted this into her, and then they believed he had literally kicked it into her. They believe that she had already been dead by the point of this happening. I don't know how, but that was somehow almost relieving to hear at that point. The week or so securing that scene was creepy for sure, but the several hours of time spent in that autopsy made me question humanity and really changed my perspective on life as a whole. 2 combat tours in Iraq, and this was probably the worst thing I had experienced during my time. When I was 12, I moved to my grandparents' campground in Dayton, Tennessee. One half of the campground was dedicated to RV and tent campers. The other half was a trailer park for more permanent residents. My grandmother worked 7 days a week at the mum and pop shop. She sold bait, tackle gear, sandwiches, soda, candy, camping supplies and beer. We were the only dock on Lake Chickamauga with a gas pump, so we were always busy during the summer months. It was my job to run up and down the dock and pump boaters' gas for them. It was a fun job. I got to see a lot of pretty girls in bikinis. In the trailer park area of the campground, there was an old couple living in a mobile home. They had a pontoon boat, berthed at our dock, and a nice car. They were model tenants, and they always paid their rent on time, sometimes even early. But then one day, we noticed that their pontoon boat was gone. But we didn't really say much about it. Then we noticed that their car was gone as well. Then, rent day came and went. A week went by. Gran became concerned, so she walked to the trailer and knocked on the door. There was no response, but there was a note taped to the door. Nurses, come in. The older wife had to use a walker, but had recently took a turn for the worse with her health. Nurses would come and visit and take care of her every other day. Gran tried to open the door, but it was locked. She pounded on the door and called out their names, but received no reply. It was at this point that Gran became heavily concerned, so she called the sheriff, Leon Sneed, and he showed up about 10 minutes later. Graham gave him permission to force the door open, and the sheriff kicked in the door, and immediately put his hand over his nose and mouth and said to not go in there. It wasn't before long that more police and then an ambulance arrived. By this point, naturally, a crowd had started to gather. We all knew each other. Some were campers just passing through, but the crowd kept growing and growing. Eventually, 2 body bags were brought out of the trailer and put in the ambulance. Sheriff Sneed showed us photographs and explained to us what happened. Evidently, this old couple were behind on financial obligations. They repossessed their pontoon boat, their car, and they denied the wife's insurance. They had no family, no children, just themselves. It was murder and suicide. The man had left a suicide note, and this is what it said. "This is what happens to old people today when you run out of money." He had his wife put on her favourite dress. Then he strangled her to death and put her body on the kitchen table. Then he proceeded to drag a chair to the hallway and hammered a leather belt into the top of the hallway. He tightened it around his neck. Then he kicked the chair out from underneath him. When Sheriff Sneed found him, he was hanging lifelessly. But there were deep fingernail claw marks around his neck, where he most likely tried to free himself, but to no avail. The most chilling part of the story, other than the murder-suicide itself, was the fact that the trailer had only been 15 feet away from my school bus stop. It was estimated that they had been dead for at least a week, so that means for 5 days straight, I was standing 50 feet away from 2 dead bodies, and I never knew. I am not a police officer, but I worked with the state police, running tows for them. And this 2012 Christmas still gives me nightmares. We received an emergency call to a crash that was blocking traffic both ways. We ran over there with a flatbed, assuming the worst. But when we got there, we were met with a rather awful scene. Usually people are banged up, and we wait for them to be pulled out and then tow the car. So this was a first for me. The pickup truck was indeed blocking traffic. It had been T-boned, pulling out of a Walmart parking lot. The truck was turned around the center of the road, cops and medics just standing around. We approached the scene. The horn is still blaring on the truck. There is a man hunched over, and his brain is splattered all over the interior of the truck. His head is mangled, and now parts of the steering wheel, hence the blaring horn. The gate of the truck had come down, throwing Christmas presents perfectly wrapped, with bows and cards all over the road. Between brains and Christmas gifts, I quit that night. I was interning with the sheriff's police department, so most of my time was spent on patrol. We got called out to do a wellness check with the deputy, and he thought it was going to be a piece of cake, like she was out of town or something. We get there and are met by the neighbours, who told us that the mail is piling up in the mailbox and that there are several untouched packages on the porch. So we get up the house, and the front door is unsecured. So we crack open the door a couple of inches, and the deputy calls inside, but the door won't move anymore. The house was one of those split houses, where the stairs meet at the front door, and the upstairs and downstairs are offset, so we concluded that there might be stuff behind the door. It's about this time that the deputy tells me that she is a known hoarder, and that could be why the door was stuck. He also mentions that if we see flies on the insides of the window, she is most likely inside and deceased. As we walk around the side of the house, we notice a lot of flies on the windows. The back door was locked, and as we looked in, we noticed bags on bags of garbage, diapers, and miscellaneous shit all over the place. We head back to the front and attempt to make entry. He pushes the door open, this time with more force, and from underneath, I see a grease-like liquid spreading out from underneath the door. The deputy stops, closes the door, and calmly tells me that the lady was indeed dead and wedged behind the door. From the date of the packages, we concluded that she had been dead about 2 months. Once we did make entry into the house, I was allowed inside. After 2 months, she didn't even look like a human corpse. Her skin and body had sagged and melted into the floor, and her face was all black and had been eaten to the bone by maggots. I'll never forget the smell when the coroner moved her and she popped. It was like a physical presence. Whatever those people get paid to deal with that shit, it's not enough. The thing that really got me though was wondering if she had fallen down the stairs and died there, or if she fell and was unable to move and waited for help that would never come. I was speaking to one of the guys who was with me that day, and he told me a story about something that had happened to him. He used to work for a disaster and restoration company, cleaning up after fires or water damage. For whatever reason, he once got a job to clean up a dead body. It was the only time the company got a job like that, and the body itself had been removed, but the smell and chunks of flesh were remaining, and it was horrific. He told me it was the absolute worst thing he had ever smelled. No one in the whole company had the guts to do it, so it ended up being landed with him. He had to scrub up the chunky human sauce and remove the couch where the body had been found 2 weeks earlier. Even the floorboards had to be removed because the blood was so entrenched. You could smell the stink from a block away. It was also his job to concoct an anti-stink chemical mix to try and get rid of the smell. He pumped about 1 gallon of several industrial strength chemicals to rid of it completely over the next few days. Even then, I'm still not sure what the smell was. Even then, he's still not sure if the smell was completely gone from the house. Though, he says it may just be the fact that from working the job, the smell was just stuck in his nostrils. This is a case which I had to deal with personally. There were 2 adults that were reported missing, the parents of 2 adult children, 1 male, 1 female. Alerts are in place for the missing people's credit cards. The father's credit card hits on a purchase at a jewellery store where an engagement ring was purchased. This quickly leads us to the son who made the purchase of the ring. We get the son in for questioning, and it didn't take him long to crack, and he confessed to killing both parents and burying them in shallow graves. The son led us to the gravesite, and we began the process of recovery. Both mother and father had a black garbage bag over their head, being held in place by duct tape around their necks. The sight of the bodies, especially their faces, once the bags were removed, and the smell, was something I'll never forget. His parents were drunks and lived an alternate lifestyle. On the night he killed them, he said his dad tore into him pretty good, calling him a loser, and a loser that was a mistake. He should never have been born. But he said what threw him over the edge was his dad calling him half a man. He flew into a rage and choked him out. The mother watched and did nothing. She realized that Dad was dead and said something to the effect that she was right about him, and the son gave it to her too. The girlfriend helped clean up the bodies and disposed of them. It didn't take the girlfriend long to flip and testify. I was working the third shift on Halloween night. I'm out by one of our smaller lakes just outside the city limits. Kids love to go out and drink, which is surrounded by some very nice houses. Going through the neighborhood, each of the roads ends at a small two-lane road that surrounds the lake. I'm slowing to the stop sign, and I'm already starting to look to my right to make the turn when my headlights start tracking the rock wall that surrounds the lake. I catch something out of the corner of my eye in one of the large trees that dots the walk path. I back up to see what it is, and it's a guy hanging. At first I thought it was a Halloween decoration. The neighborhood is really into decorating every holiday. So I stop, get out, and as soon as my flashlight hits him, I realize no decoration, nope, he's dead. As I'm standing there getting ready to call it in, I notice a gaggle of kids coming from down the street, trick-or-treating. Shit. As soon as they see my car, they start heading my way faster. So I book it back up the block to meet the parent walking with them and tell her she needs to take the long way around the block, as she can see in my face that I'm not kidding. Turned out, it was a 20-year-old that was devastated about his girlfriend breaking up with him, and she lived in the last house on the block, so she would see him next morning when she looked out of her window. I was called out to negotiate with a 17-year-old female who had barricaded herself in a bathroom with multiple knives and scissors. She'd done it very well too, as SWAT ended up going through the sheetrock wall. She wouldn't talk with me at all, but had multiple graphic conversations with her mother, who committed suicide 3 years earlier, and her dad, who's serving lots of years in prison for sexually abusing her. When SWAT pulled her out, she had completed multiple circumcisions on herself with the scissors, completely cut her own nipples off, and had sodomized herself multiple times with multiple steak knives. The kicker was, she was talking the whole time, and her tone or volume never changed. The pain never bothered her, or, more likely, she never felt it. The human mind is a scary thing. One cold October night, we got a call to assist the sheriff's office on a burglary in progress out in the country. Because our radios couldn't talk to the country roads, the country dispatch telephoned our dispatch, and our dispatch radio relayed the information to us. We basically had no info and didn't know where we were going, and I had a lonely, eerie, creepy feeling in my bones whilst driving at crazy speeds to help this family. It took us probably 25 minutes to arrive on the scene. This house was dark. It turned out the suspect had cut the power days before and had been living in the house while the family of 4 was on vacation. Walking through the yard to the front door, I could hear a man yelling, "Get out of my house, please," politely, but firm and loud. I walked in and found an obviously mentally unstable young man, dirty, bearded, with wild eyes, calmly almost whispering, "I was sent. I'm supposed to be here. This is the place. This is the place. I was sent here. You'll be sorry." He didn't respond at all to verbal commands, but he didn't resist at all when I put the cuffs on him. It was like he was looking through me while I was questioning him and searched his backpack. I was honestly freaked out. Even though I was significantly bigger than him, it was just unsettling. I didn't even want to put the guy in the back of the car. I didn't want to have my back to that tricky guy. His backpack was full of miscellaneous items, a notebook full of drawn monsters and rambling writings, a hunting knife, clothes that could have been his, mail from different addresses and names, kids' school maths books. It was just weird. Eventually, a county deputy arrived and took him away. I never did hear anything else about it. This reminded me of another time. I was very new and ended up having to babysit a TDO whilst waiting for a mental health services to arrive. It was just he and I in a tiny interrogation room. He was bearded, dirty, erratic, eyes were creepy, and he gave me the creeps. Whenever I would ask him a question like, "Nice night, huh?" he would respond by stopping whatever fidgeting he was doing, look upon the upper corner of a room, and nodding and mumbling, before looking back at me and answering the question. It was like he was getting his orders from an invisible demon hovering in the corner. I was genuinely afraid this nutcase was going to overpower me, take my gun, and go on a killing spree. I was just out of the academy and this guy was clearly capable of violence. The on-call mental health professional that night was a smoking hot young thin girl who immediately sat right beside him and put a sharp pencil in his hand. I was positive that I would be wresting that pencil from his hand later, but he calmed down when she arrived. Weird. I heard these stories from my dad. He worked for a restoration company, and they had a contract with the city for first responses to certain emergencies. The cops were called to do a welfare check on a woman. The family hadn't heard from her in a week or so. When they got there, they could see her lying on the ground by the front door through the window. They ended up breaking down the back door in order to get in, but she was long gone. So they called the restoration company to come board up the broken back door. My dad arrived on scene before they removed the body. She was all bloated and nasty. My dad had never seen a dead body and was a bit disturbed. The chief of the fire department was there and asked him if he was okay and if it was his first dead body. My dad was like, yeah, and the fire chief didn't seem bothered at all. So my dad asked him what the worst thing was that he'd ever seen. He had 3 stories, and this in my opinion was the most disturbing. The scene. Apparently, bystanders had seen a guy on his cell phone, and he was clearly arguing with someone. He hung up abruptly and threw his phone on the ground in anger, and then walked out to the highway. A 16-wheel semi was driving up, and he jumped out in front of it. The driver tried to stop, but every single wheel ran him over. When the fire chief got there, he said there were body parts and little pieces everywhere. The chief thought there was no way someone could survive that. He walked up to the majority of the body and heard noises. Apparently the guy was still breathing. Then after a moment he stopped. Immediately the chief goes in to start performing CPR. As soon as he touched the man's face, his whole head caved in like a rotting pumpkin. About 9 years ago, we get a call from a payphone. There's a dead body in the abandoned building at corner 1st and Main. An officer responds to the area and can't find anything that would be considered an abandoned building. The caller hangs up without leaving any information, and the payphone that he called from was several miles from the area. So the officer clears out the call having no contact. The next day, we get another phone from another payphone. There's a dead body inside the abandoned building at the corner of 1st and Main. Again, they hung up without offering any other information. This time, I get dispatched the report. I head up to the area of the intersection and start looking around. Now, understand that I live and work in a fairly sizable metropolitan area, and this was when the economy was still good, booming even. Abandoned buildings were hard to come by at the time. I drive through all the shopping plaza in a little industrial complex within the vicinity of that intersection, and I can't come up with anything. So I start driving a little bit further in each direction. But I remember that there's some new construction that hasn't been finished yet, and I wonder if they think that those are considered abandoned. I get out of my car and walk through a bunch of businesses that are still in the framing stages, but I can't find anything. As I leave the area, I'm now more than a mile from the original call location. As I pull out onto the major roadway, I stop for traffic and look in front of me. There it is, a gigantic electrical component factory that has been vacant for probably the last 15 years. It has a 9-foot wall around the entire perimeter, and the landscaping is still maintained, so it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb right away. That, added to the fact that I'm pretty far away from where the caller said it should be. But then again, it's abandoned. It's definitely abandoned, and has been for a very long time. So I call for another unit to back me up, and we go check it out. We use a drainage pipe to climb in, and over the 9-foot wall to get inside the perimeter. We start walking the building, checking every single door. When I say this place is big, I mean it's absolutely huge. It's over 100,000 square foot. It's like an old abandoned Motorola or Freescale or Intel type building. It has gigantic coolers on the outside, pipes running all the way down, ductwork running down the sides of the building, loading docks, and a basement. Every door we come across is locked and secured. We continue walking around, looking for anything out of place. As I get about 3/4 of the way around the building, I pull on a door and it flings open. I call my backup, who comes over to me. We knock, announce, and enter the building. As we step into a hallway that leads about 100 yards down, the doors on either side, the door we just stepped into closes, and it's black. Pitch black. Like I can't see my nose on my face black. We start moving through the building, trying to clear each room, to the best that two of us can. But this place is absolutely enormous, and each room is connected to what seems to be 4 other rooms. We stepped into one room, and the door closes behind us. It must have been some old clean room or something. It was the weirdest thing, because there was no sound. Nothing. I couldn't even hear traffic outside, or the grumble of electricity, or air moving. All the sounds that we heard through the rest of the building were gone into this one room. When I spoke to my partner, our voices didn't even echo. It must have been some kind of sound cancelling insulation or something, but it freaked me the hell out. The floor had random 12-inch holes in it that led down to a basement that was flooded by over 6 feet of water. Wire ceiling panels and wire jacketing were hanging from the ceiling. There was broken glass, broken pieces of metal, and brick holes in the drywall, and abandoned equipment all over. I clearly remember thinking to myself that if there ever would be a time that we were to be attacked by skinless zombie dogs, this would be it. And the entire time, we are trying to find a dead body. As if this shit wasn't freaky enough, I'm actively looking for a dead guy. We end up moving through the building, clearing it as best we can, until we get to what was definitely the industrial part of the building. Gigantic boilers, evaporative coolers, and components that run the building. Oh, and spiders. A shit ton of spiders. We stepped into a room and find that it's a dead end. We've reached the end of the building and we don't have any further to go. The room is around 20 by 30 meters and contains 5 very large electrical cabinets. They're about 8 feet tall and each about 4 feet wide, sitting next to each other. And they look exactly how I would design the lab of an evil genius if I had to make a sci-fi movie. The entire thing was covered in dials, levers, and red and green buttons, but only the panel in the middle was still illuminated. It had one glowing red light on it, the first and only light I saw in the entire building. My partner calls out to me, "You got anything?" I replied with no, nothing in here. Looks like this was a gigantic waste of our time. Just let me take a look behind these cabinets and we'll be good to head back to the cars. The panels have around 18 to 24 inches of room on each and between them and the walls behind them. I walk over to the left side and peek my head round, and bam, there he is, a dead guy on the ground, pinned between the wall and the cabinet. He's on his back, arms in front of his chest like a T-Rex, and he has some injuries, and I nearly shot him. I'm not gonna lie, he scared the living shit out of me. even though I spent the last hour actively looking for him. I still wasn't completely ready for it. So, skip ahead to calling detectives. At the time, stripping copper was fairly new. At least, to our area. I didn't recognize what the wire jacketing meant, as I hadn't seen it before. These two knuckleheads, in breaking into this abandoned factory for God knows how long, and systematically stripping every piece of metal out of it, and they made it all the way to the very last room, the only room that still had power running into it. See, the middle panel, you controlled the fire suppression system for the building, and the owner's insurance policy required that it remain non-active. When these guys opened up the panels, they must have thought they hit the mother lode. Each contained an 1.5-inch copper cable. Now, an 1.5-inch copper cable is worth quite a bit of money, but it also conducts quite a bit of electricity. They cut through the first one successfully, and leaving the sharp end exposed inside the cabinet. But when this poor sap started cutting into the second one, he got the right of his lifetime. Not only did he electrocute himself, but the current coursing through his arms pulled him into the cabinet, stabbing one of the exposed ends of the previous cable into his chest. This kills the copper thief. What always struck me was that his accomplice never came forward to identify himself. When we contacted the descendants' families, they denied knowing anything about his copper stealing habits. So these two probably stole around $150,000 worth of copper together over several months. And at the end of the day, his body left him dead to rot away in an abandoned warehouse. No honor amongst thieves. I answer 911 lines. I had an open line of a guy yelling, "Ow," in between thud noises. He didn't respond to anything I said. Turns out, those thuds were the sound of him chopping off his fingers with a meat cleaver. I had a Good Samaritan call about a guy who pulled up in front of a medical center in his car. He had a travel blender plugged into his vehicle, and he was bleeding heavily. He had chopped off his own dick and put it in the blender. I forget the specifics as to why, but it had something to do with a pending child molestation or rape case. Last but not least, the one that will stick with me is the woman who called around 8 in the morning on a Sunday, telling me in an eerily calm voice that she had killed her baby by bashing its head into the floor because the devil was inside him. I didn't believe her, but it was true. My father has been an officer for over 20 years, and this story is probably the worst thing he ever had to do. My father and I were heading to the range one day to sight in our hunting rifles. We were in his police vehicle, since we were going to the shooting range for local law enforcement personnel. Dispatch came over the radio to get an officer out to a 911 call of a possible dead body. Many of the officers joked over the radio that it was probably a prank or someone overreacting, since it was around the time of Halloween. The responding officer arrives at the scene and calls in that he is going into the woods to investigate. A few minutes later, he sends out a call confirming that it is an actual dead body and to get the necessary resources sent out to assist. Then the responding officer personally calls my father because he recognized the body. It was my dad's brother. He had been having rough times and decided to end it all by hanging himself from a tree 50 yards into the wood next to the railroad tracks. The second worst part was that he had been reported missing for a few months. So by the time that they found his body, he was severely rotted. The worst part was that my father had to go to assist in the removal and scene investigation. That was the first day I ever saw my father cry, and I was in my mid-teens. This is a story told to me by a guy I apprenticed for. He was a New Jersey cop in the 80s and went to a 90-year-old woman's house with his partner on a welfare check. No response to knocking on the door, so they circle the property. My apprentice master looks through a back window and saw the little old lady. The glass was rippled and not very clear, but it looked like she was floating. He knocks on that window and the lady doesn't move. He thinks he may have hung herself. They try the nearest door and it opens. They hit the room's lights and see the little old lady in the kitchen, dead. Her lower jaw impaled beneath the chin on a very sharp iron, Spanish-style cabinet handle. She must have been standing on the counter reaching for something, and then slipped. Because the handle was pointed like an arrowhead, they couldn't lift her off the spike. It was the 80s and in Jersey, so they didn't have time to wait for someone to bring cutters for the iron, and they had tough stomachs and no consciences. And after a few minutes of trying to jiggle her jaw off, my apprentice master says screw it and pulls out a combat knife and saws the old lady's jaw off from her face at the hinges, then splits the remaining jaw in half and took it off that way. He laughed telling me that story. No laughs were had from my end. I am a paramedic, and I responded to a call for a cardiac arrest. Turns out the guy hadn't paid rent in 3 months. The landlord got pissed and sent a locksmith round to change the locks. We walked up the stairs to the apartment to be greeted by a locksmith vomiting on the stairs and flies. They were big, dumb death flies bouncing off our faces. It was like a low-budget scene from The Mummy. We enter the apartment and it's really gloomy. The curtains closed, dimly lit, TV on, cycling through all the settings by itself. Color contrast, brightness, repeat. I hate this part. Where is he then? I wonder. So we scanned the room. Dried old blood on the carpet amongst the beer cans and trash. Chair, sofa, lamp, TV. Where the hell is he? Chair, sofa, lamp. Oh wait. The lamp was the dude. No head. Sitting in the corner of the room. He was naked. Had his back turned. Almost skeletal. His neck muscles had rotted, and his head had fallen down his back. His pelvis had 2 large holes either side, and they were crawling with maggots, and the source of our welcoming party of death flies. We then had to wait 20 minutes before the police showed up, and had fun playing spot the dead guy with the rookie cop. I am a 911 dispatcher. I received a call from an elderly lady who had trouble breathing. I had taken several calls from her and her husband in the past, so I recognized her voice. I dispatched an ambulance to her residence and held her on the line, trying to keep her calm while the ambulance was responding. The ambulance advised me that they would be roughly 15 minutes. She lived in a very rural part of West Virginia. I'm talking to her about her husband and how he was doing and just making small talk with her. The ambulance calls in and advises that they are on the scene, and I let them know that she is in severe respiratory distress and I still had her on the line. I let her know the ambulance is coming to the door and to go onto the door, and she says okay and hangs up the phone. Pretty normal, right? Well, here is where it gets strange. The EMT and paramedic on scene call about a minute later and advise that no one has answered the door. We have a sheriff unit who was in the area pulling on scene about that time. The sheriff unit confirmed the address and advised he is breaching the door to make access to the property. 5 minutes go by and the paramedic on scene radios in asking who the caller was. I advise it was an elderly female who lived at the residence. He tells me that he's going to need to call in and speak with the supervisor on shift. We get him over to the supervisor, and the supervisor confirms the information that I gave him and asks what's going on. Apparently, the elderly female had been dead for a while and was already in full rigor mortis. They thought I was wrong on the caller, but the other dispatcher played it back and confirmed it was the female who called. The ambulance transferred the hospital, and we got the same calls of disbelief from the doctors. My brother was a police officer for a while. One night, he came over and had dinner with us. He was married and had kids. He was really quiet, and I asked him if everything was okay. Here's what he said. First, he swallowed the food in his mouth, took a quick drink, and just stared at his plate for a bit. That's when he starts talking. A guy gets ripping drunk at a bar, easily over the limit, almost double, jumps on his motorcycle and screams through town at about 80 miles an hour. He runs a red light and T-bones a pickup truck, flies over the bed of the truck, and skids out about 55 feet later. No broken bones, but lots of road rash. He's in the hospital for a couple of days and then is sent off to jail. Another motorcycle accident. An older couple on a Goldwing. All safety gear, obeying the law the whole time. A Toyota Tacoma hits them at about 35 miles an hour. He breaks his neck on the curb and is dead on the spot. She gets pinned under the bike, leg broken and knee wasted. Probably have to amputate. I was on both calls about 2 hours apart. Sometimes you just gotta wonder. And then he went back to eating dinner. I got a call for a missing child. I got to the home to find the mother highly distressed and not sure what to do. I called in everyone to first search the home and property. I decided to search the backyard, since it was a large wooded lot with no visible fence. After around 10 minutes, I found the boy. He was caught on an old chain link fence in the woods that was blocked by a bunch of trees, so you couldn't see him from the house. He had basically gotten strangled to death on a fence. He must have been climbing, fell on it, and got his hooded sweatshirt caught. The worst part for me was having to call it on the radio, knowing the mother might hear it from the inside from one of the other officers. My dad used to work in a precinct with one of the highest crime rates in New York City. I think it had the highest murder rate during his years on the job. Anyway, he won't tell us stories about what he's seen, because they're mostly horrific, and still give him nightmares almost 15 years off the job. However, I do remember he told us one story when he was really drunk. A woman in her 20s walked into her apartment building late from work one night and was waiting for her elevator. It opened, and the only person in there was a creepy looking guy. Though apprehensive, she got in and pressed her floor number, but noticed that the basement button was pressed. Normally, after 9 PM, maintenance would lock the basement button to prevent random people from going down there and messing shit up. I guess someone forgot to lock it. The creepy guy ended up taking her down there, tying her up, raping and torturing her for hours. He then took her apartment key, went up to the floor that she'd pressed when she'd first gotten into the elevator, tried every door until he found hers, and took her roommate, who was also a woman in her 20s, into the basement, where he continued torturing and raping both women until dawn. Maintenance found them that morning, and my dad was a responder. Again, my dad never told us stories. This one might have stuck out, because he has 4 daughters, but I think it's got to be up there in the creepy factor. I work for the police force. This is one of the eeriest calls that I've ever been asked to do. We have this older gentleman who lives alone. He's a frequent caller about hearing someone upstairs. I'd never been called to do this particular one before, but other people had, and they told me to be wary on my first time, that it was a creepy place, and to let them know if I saw anything. At first, I wasn't really sure what they meant, but I went to do the call anyway. The house was basically a time capsule. The gentleman insisted that someone was upstairs and that he was using the air conditioning ducts to get from the top floor to the first floor. The house was split like a duplex, and the only way to get upstairs was from an outside entrance. So my partner and I went up to the second floor to clear it. We were not disappointed. It was a very eerie setup. A record player with a chair set up in the front, and headphones still plugged in laying on the chair. Very old appliances in the kitchen, as well as old electronics, all in great condition, as well as a stack of adult magazines, all from way back in the day, spread out in the living room area. Everything undisturbed with a layer of dust on it for God knows how long. We didn't find anyone up there, but the atmosphere was particularly creepy. He called back a few more times saying that someone was messing with him upstairs We always make the rookies go, as an almost initiation of sorts, to see if anything creepy will befall them on their first visit. We had a call of a suspicious vehicle sitting in front of a drug house, where we had a quadruple homicide the year before. An officer went out to check, and the vehicle took off. Our policy prevented the officer from pursuing the vehicle. Soon after, the suspect shot at another officer, ditched the vehicle, and broke into a nearby house through the back door to hide. The homeowner, an elderly man, tried to call 911, but was unable to say much before the suspect attacked him. We surrounded the house, but the supervisors wouldn't let us go in under exigent circumstances because they were afraid of liability, as we didn't know for sure if he was in the house, and a judge refused to sign a search warrant. A family member came by later and called when he found the door barricaded and couldn't get inside. He gave us a key, and I was one of the first ones in. There was blood covering the floors and all over the walls. There were 2 bodies wrapped in bloody sheets in the hallway. The suspect had to still be in the house, and possibly still armed. We pulled the sheets back, and there was the homeowner. The suspect had beaten his face with an iron until it caved into his skull. Then he stabbed him numerous times in the face and neck with a steak knife. His face was completely mangled. The other body, right next to the victim, was the suspect. He was pretending to be dead. We drag him out so hard that his clothes rip off. He woke up and began telling us a lie about being attacked by a group of guys. He later admitted to shooting at the officer and murdering the old man. The worst part was when he said that the old man took a while to die. He was still breathing when we had the house surrounded, and the supervisors and judges wouldn't let us go in the house. I am a small-town cop. One time, we had an elderly woman with dementia call at about 3 a.m. and say that there was a baby hanging in her grandfather clock. I got there, and it was a pretty big house, and she had a single light on in the living room, making it all the more creepy. When she points out the clock, it's quite obvious she is hallucinating, but just imagining what she was seeing gives me the creeps. Ever since starting this job, I have extreme sympathy for those with dementia or schizophrenia. I never knew what they went through before I started working as a cop. Them seeing or hearing people in their house in the middle of the night. I couldn't imagine. We also had a guy in a plow truck get hit by a train during a snowstorm. Obviously, fatal accidents happen every day, but the call came in as the train hitting a plow truck. No injuries. So when I show up, I start calmly walking up the tracks, thinking the train just clipped the truck, or the driver got up before the truck got it, and it would be a routine accident. Nope. I get to the tracks, see a mangled plow truck in a small pond next to the tracks, and a yellow jacket floating with 2 boots sticking out the water. The driver got ejected when the train, doing 65 miles an hour, hit the truck and died instantly. I had to compose myself and call out what I was seeing on the radio. Finally, I'll never forget my first unresponsive person call. I was 23 years old and a week out of the academy, still obviously riding with my training officer. We got to the house before the medics, and it was a 30-year-old male. He was completely naked in bed, with 3 fans blowing on him. My training officer gave him a little sternum rub, and he opened his eyes and started moaning. Being the new guy, I get sent downstairs to talk to his mum about any medical conditions he has or had, and medications he was taking. The medics get there, and I start bringing him down the stairs. He's white as a ghost. His eyes are wide open, and his mouth is hanging open. I hear my training officer say that he doesn't look good, and one of the medics answers, "He's not. He just coded. Not breathing, no pulse." Creepy thing is, as they were bringing him down the stairs, he was looking right at me. First time I've ever seen the emptiness that comes with someone who is technically dead. Happy ending though. Medics brought him back whilst en route to the hospital.
I am an ex-cop. We got a frantic call from a guy that said his girlfriend wasn't breathing, and he didn't know how long she'd been down. We got there, and it was pretty obvious to us that there wasn't anything we could do for her. She was cold and had some major rigor mortis setting in. We spoke to the guy, and he said that she didn't live with him, but she had stayed there that night. He said they had been having a few drinks, and they had an argument. After a while, they decided to end things. She didn't want to go home, since she'd been drinking, so they agreed that she could sleep on the couch. Apparently, after she went to bed, she got up and went and got a bunch of sleeping pills and some other meds out of her bag. She took a whole bunch of them, sat down at his computer to write her suicide note, and that was it. We were reading the note, and in it, she described all of the things she was feeling, happening as the pills were going through her system. She described all of the different things she felt, until the typing just slowly trailed off to random keys, and then just stopped completely. It was both very weird and really cool at the same time. I felt awful for her boyfriend. He probably still carries that guilt with him to this day. The letter basically said that their relationship was great and how she loved him, but she was so angry with him too. Then she would talk about how the pills were making her feel. She said stuff about being lightheaded and then having vision problems. Then she started talking about her relationship again, and it went back and forth like that for 3 or 4 pages. This was over a decade ago, and remains one of the saddest and creepiest cases I've ever had to work on. For some reason, the suicides always hit me the hardest. I had a good friend that killed himself in high school. So suicide is a touchy thing, not just for everyone, but especially for those who have experienced it and had to deal with it on a much more personal level. I've seen 3 suicides by gun, 2 hanging, and a handful that did it intentionally, by using drugs of some sort, or other, more creative methods. Long story short, we were called, and a guy shot himself in his garage with a .357 Magnum. I have a pretty strong stomach, thankfully, because of experience. But I believe I accidentally stepped on a piece of his eye. When I cleared the call, I went straight to the locker room and cleaned the bottom of my boots for a good 40 minutes. And then I repeated the same cleaning process at home. Now that experience was disturbing for sure, but this one was creepy. We get a call from the hotel that's off the interstate. The employees went to clean a room and found a note on the bathroom door, which was closed and locked. It read as follows: "Don't come in, call 911. So the front desk did just that. We get there, and she shows us the room. We were knocking on the bathroom door, to no answer. We weren't even sure if there was someone in there or not. The on-site manager told us that we were allowed to force entry into the bathroom. She was concerned because none of the employees ever remember the guest checking out. My partner gets the door open, and it was like something out of a horror movie. The guy was in the tub, completely naked, with a knife on the floor just next to the tub. Cuts on his wrists, and the absolute worst thing was the blood inside the tub. I have never seen so much blood in my 10+ year career. His face was pale white, and it appeared as he was frowning. He didn't appear to be breathing. My partner shouts to call a medic, and I just look at him and say, no. Dude's dead. I'm not touching him. You can check if you want, but we need to get our supervisor, an EVT, and a detective here. I could recognize a dead guy when I saw one. I get the manager, who is legitimately having a panic attack. I tell them to calm down and head back down to the desk while we deal with this. We called for another car and told dispatch to contract our evidence technicians and a detective. When I hear my partner scream and exclaim, "Oh shit!" I run back over there, and he's wide-eyed staring at the body. "He just moved! The man's alive!" "What are you talking about?" "He has a pulse. It's faint as hell, but he has it." His legs moved under the water, and I tried checking for it. Sure enough, I put my big boy undies on, and I could barely feel a pulse on this guy. Medics called, and they were rushing him to the ER. Turned out, he did the cutting just minutes before the maids cleaning the room found the note. So, fortunately, he barely lived. But it wasn't pretty. He cut his wrists while he was bathing. A majority of what looked like blood was indeed blood, but it was mixed with water, which made it look like there was a lot more blood than what he actually spilled. And in all honesty, cutting your wrists isn't a great way to off yourself. He thinks he was bleeding for about 10 or 15 minutes before he started to go to sleep. And he would have been fine for a little longer as long as he got help. It depends on a lot of other circumstances. And I know I should have been more proactive in checking for signs of life. It was irresponsible of me
not to check sooner. In many instances, it's fairly easy to spot a corpse when you have one, but this one really tricked us, and we learnt from that. Thankfully, my partner did while I stepped out, and I was not intending to stop him from doing so. My tone was more cynical. Dude, he looks dead. I really don't think we need a medic. You can check on him, but I don't want to." And in our defense, he really did appear to be 100% dead. No chest movement, pale skin. It looked like he could have been there for hours. But like I said, I was wrong, and I acknowledge that. Sometimes you forget that your experience and training isn't objective. And still, being relatively new then, it was a learning experience for me. You can bet from then on, we, and the whole department, were a hell of a lot more cautious. I was in the academy and doing a ride-along with my sheriff's officer for experience. We were just finishing up dinner when a call went out for a Signal 7, death, on the local interstate. Scene was less than 2 miles away from where we were. Roll over to the scene, and the local police department is there, looking at the gigantic light pole that had brain matter on it from the impact of the car, which had split in half. I walk up beside the PD and ask where Signal 7 is. Look down, they say. Less than 6 inches from my feet is the driver of the vehicle, laying in 6 inches of weeds with his head split open like a ripe tomato. Death reconstruction and eyewitness accounts indicate that the young man was driving at a high rate of 80 miles an hour in the right lane of a 3-lane northbound interstate. He got distracted by talking on the phone and overcorrected when he drifted into the middle lane. Overcorrection resulted in his vehicle losing trajectory, striking a light pole with an 8-foot diameter, as lights are mounted about 150 feet up, around the driver's side B pillar between front and rear door, and the car was split in half, with the driver's head being wedged between the kinetic energy of the still moving vehicle and the stationary resistance of the light pole as the car split. His head looked like a tomato in a vice. 2 halves of the car were approximately 50 feet apart down the road in 45-degree opposite directions, and his flip cell phone was found about 200 feet from his body, still opened and working. The caller had hung up. I guess that's one way to end a call, but on a serious note, it was an extremely stupid way to go. Never drive and talk on your phone. People always think they're oblivious. It will never happen to them. They're far more sophisticated and more prepared and more everything than everyone else. And of course, it's never going to happen to you, is it? But it does. It happened to that guy. And thousands of other people. Please, be better. This was in about 2010. I was really new. A call came in as an unknown problem. Basically, the 911 was so messed up, even dispatch didn't know what to call it. Turned out, this guy had just murdered his stepfather and then walked to his grandparents' house to kill them as well. He stabbed his grandmother through the eye with a Rambo-style Bowie knife, the one that had the compass in the pommel of the handle. He missed her brain by about 1/8 of an inch, so she did not die. Instead, she came running out of the house when we got there, knife sticking out of her eye, and the compass was spinning around because she was moving. My brain literally went, "That's not real," and I went past her along with several other cops before the sergeant was like, "What the actual hell are you guys doing?" She survived. We caught the guy on a stroke of pure luck. The elderly woman with a massive hunting knife for an eye was definitely the creepiest thing I can remember. My wife and I were on vacation in Florida when we got a call from my uncle, who is a police officer. They had found my wife's grandfather dead in his home. Her grandmother had passed away 6 months earlier, and he just lost himself in whiskey. He still worked, but wouldn't talk to anyone. So for us, it was not unusual not to hear from him. Here is my uncle's part of the story. He was the first responder when Frank's, my wife's grandfather, work, called the police. He hadn't been to work in 3 weeks. This was odd for someone who never took a sick day or missed a day of work. Anywho, my uncle got to his house and walked around the property, knocking on windows and doors, trying to get somebody to answer. Finally, more units arrived and they got the permission necessary to break in. They pushed a window AC unit in and crawled through the window to open the door. My uncle said they already knew he was dead from the smell around the house. They came in through the back door and searched the back half of the house and didn't find anything. They worked their way to the bedroom, and when they got to the hallway leading to the master bedroom, he said it was like something out of The Exorcist. Every inch of the hallway was covered in flies. I mean, caked. The bathroom outside the bedroom was covered. They opened the bedroom door and found Frank laying on his back on top of the blankets. His head had exploded all over the headboard, and his stomach had exploded all over the ceiling. He had died 3 weeks earlier, and a week after he died, the electricity company had switched off his electric for not paying the bill. This was the middle of summer, and he had decomposed in a room that was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They first thought it was homicide from the way his head exploded, but they found out it was from the decomposing. He died from alcohol poisoning. They found a receipt for 2 gallons of vodka from the last day he worked, and all of it was gone. My uncle didn't realize it was my wife's grandfather until he went to call the next of kin. He said when he dialed the number and my name came up from his saved contacts, he started freaking out. Bonus story. My roommate at the time was a volunteer EMT. He woke me up one Tuesday morning, holding a bottle of scotch and saying that he needed help. He told me this story as we polished off the bottle. They get a call that all available units
Police, fire, ambulance, first responders, everyone needs to show up at this house. Dispatch tries to explain, but just said everyone is screaming and I can't understand what's happening. By the time he gets there, 2 police officers and a first responder are in the yard vomiting. His group runs inside to find the first ambulance crew shaking and crying. Now, his crew gets completely concerned, but runs into the bedroom. What he happened to see was something out of a horror film. Blood on the ceiling, on the walls, on the floor, everywhere. And especially over a naked male and naked female. They are both screaming, and no one can understand where the blood came from. They check the male. He has no wounds, so they escort him out, and they begin to check on the woman. In between her legs is a constant stream of blood, and it looks like her vagina had been chewed up by a power tool. And that's when they saw it. Literally. This couple decided to make their own sex machine out of a reciprocating saw. But they decided to slide the dildo onto an actual saw blade. When they turned up the speed, well, guess what happened? Miraculously, she survived, but I'm sure with major, irreversible damage.